Hey guys, Zach here. So today I wanted to create a short little video, short and sweet hopefully, just to show you guys how to go through the motions of logging into OpenStack and starting up a VM or two. You'll notice I have a few things blocked out, this just because this is going to go on YouTube and I don't want people from the outside world poking at us. So, you'll all have your login credentials sent to you. You have to request those from either myself or another officer. I have a test account set up here that I'm going to use. So this account looks just like what your guys' account will look like. No admin features, nothing. So to note, the domain is default. You've got your username and whatever your password is. If you've changed it, then use that. If you haven't changed it, it will most likely have been sent to you or told what it was. So I've got that typed in. I'm just going to hit connect. And this will take a little bit of time because we're kind of slow depending on where you are. So I've got this nice little overview tab. Once you start creating VMs, you're going to start noticing that these are actually little pie charts. And you can kind of see on this one, you've got 1 out of 100. It's a teeny tiny little sliver. This lets you keep track of how many instances you have used out of how many you are allowed. Same thing for vCPUs and RAM. So this is basically how many virtual processors you can devote towards your virtual machines, and the same thing with the RAM. You've also got this tab for floating IPs, but we really don't use them. So we're going to jog on over to this nice little instances tab, and you can see I don't have anything here. So we're going to correct this by clicking on this nice little cloud upload image that says launch instance right over here. So you're going to click on that guy, and this nice little menu is going to pop up. So we're going to create a test instance. Leave the availability zone to Nova and the count to 1. If you want to start doing fancy things, you can actually increase this count, and it will actually create 4 different virtual machines named test instance 1, 2, 3, 4, and they'll all have the same properties. It's kind of cool if you want to spin up like a web server, but you want 4 of them. But for now, we just want 1 test instance. So the next thing on our list is the source. This is the actual operating system that your virtual machine will run. So we have a few options that are default. These are ones that we, as the administrators, have uploaded. ViOS is a special routing operating system. If you're new to VMs, don't worry about that one. You can play with it later. But the ones you'll want to focus on are these bottom 3. Ubuntu Server and CentOS are just kind of your basic Linux distro. They have a little more power. And then this guy down at the bottom, Ceros, is a very, very small, you can see he's only 12 megabytes. It's a teeny tiny little Linux distro. It's meant specifically for testing clouds. And since that's what we're going to do, we're going to use it. So if you missed what I did, we've got these arrows next to them. To select it, you just hit the arrow, it moves it up to the allocated tab, and you're good to go next. So the next thing is the flavor. The flavor actually tells it how big to be. We have a couple options here. You'll notice that you're pretty much limited to 1 or 2 vCPUs. That's because we don't have that many to pass around right now. Same thing with the RAM. You're limited to the maximum of 2 gigs of RAM and 20 gigs of disk space. That's just to keep things light on our end. Some operating systems will not run on these 2 lower tiers. If it's too small, you'll get this nice little yellow triangle that pops up. So if I actually come back here and I pop up Ubuntu instead, oh, I didn't do it. That's awkward. But you'll get this nice little triangle that'll pop up saying, wait, no, I can't use that one, it's too small. But for Ceros, since it's so small, we can use this nice little m1.tiny with 1 CPU and 512 megabytes of RAM. That's half of a gigabyte. Your phone probably has more RAM than this, but the cool thing is, it'll run on it no problem. So the next thing on our list is this Networks tab, and there are quite a few on here. You don't need to worry about these top four. These are networks for a project that we have coming up, and none of them are really working right now, unfortunately, and we're still working on that. So the one you're probably going to care about is Provider. Provider is the one that will actually give you internet access. So if you want to do things like download updates, if you want to ping Google for whatever reason, if you're on Ubuntu or CentOS and you want to install a web server like Apache, this is the one you're going to want to be on. So it's the same thing as all of them. Hit the up arrow, move it up to the allocated. The only difference with the Networks tab is you can actually add multiple of them, and it's just like you were to add another network interface card to your server. And I'll probably go over that in a later video, but for now, let's just stick with Provider. There's a few more options here. Network ports you don't need to worry about. Security groups is it's basically a virtual firewall that wraps around your VM. So by default you have this one guy named default that pretty much just lets all the traffic in and out. I think there's some weird quirks where it will block certain traffic, but for the most part the default one should be okay. You've also got this key pair. The key pairs are for SSH keys, so if you're using the stock CentOS or the stock Ubuntu image, you have to log in with an SSH key unless you come down to this configuration tab and put in a nice custom script. So this next tab lets you actually customize your operating system before you launch it. There are a ton of things you can do here. My most common one is to actually set a default password for an image like Ubuntu, where it's designed to only let you log in with an SSH key. If you're really curious on it, look up Cloud Init or Cloud Config scripts, and there is a whole book. You could get your own PhD on just trying to learn how to configure Cloud Init to do funny stuff. The rest of the stuff we're not going to really worry about. You can define some metadata if you want. It really doesn't do much. The scheduler hints also, we don't have any of them set up. So with all that done, all I have to do now is click Launch Instance. So it's going to think for a minute, and it's going to start building our instance. And it's going to take its sweet time because we're on a little slow hardware, unfortunately. But eventually we'll get our VM running. So we got an IP address already. Should be up just about now. Almost. Well, while we're waiting, I'll point out a few things. So on this tab you have a bunch of items, bunch of columns, and this will be a big table once you have a bunch of VMs running. So the first row, or first column, excuse me, is the name. So this is the name that you just named it. If you named it my test instance, that's what would show up here. Since I named mine just test instance, that's what I get. You'll notice that it's a link. The link will actually take you to an information page where you have some other options. Alternatively, all those options live in this nice little drop-down menu, which I'll talk about in just a minute. You have this column for image name, actually tells you which image it's running. So if you forget, I can't remember if test instance 1 is running Ubuntu or test instance 2 is running Ubuntu, all you got to do is look. The other column that comes up next is your IP address. So this is the address that is going to be allocated to my VM on the network that I selected. In this case, it's the provider network. So the networking for the VMs is kind of funny. It's basically DHCP under the hood. If you don't know what that is, you should look it up. It's a really cool protocol and it's really useful. But basically it tells your VM, hey, we've set up this IP address for you, you should use it, and your VM will say, okay, and it'll use it. You also have your flavor. This tells you how big it is, so like your image, if you forgot what you set it to, you can just take a quick glance and see, oh yeah, that's got 2 cores and I expected it to have 4, no wonder it's running kind of slow. Key pair, I didn't set one, so there's nothing here, but if you do set a key pair, it will tell you which one. That's also useful if you're trying to log in and you're using the wrong key pair and you're pulling your hair out because you can't remember which one you're using. Come check this column. That'll save you some hair pulling. Status active. The status and the power state will give you a couple of key details about your VM. If it fails, these two are going to tell you that it's failed. So the status, I think you probably noticed that the status was not active while it was building, and the task was spawning, and then, or it was build and then spawning, and then somewhere in there was networking. So these three tabs actually will give you an idea of what's going on with your VM. The power state is pretty obvious. It's either running or it's shut down, or it can be shelved, which we'll talk about later. The availability zone, availability zones basically give you the ability to put two data centers in different geographical locations and specify that they are separate. So for instance, we could have this one in, say, same old place it is, West Coast, and we could have another setup on the East Coast, and we could have two availability zones. So if you're on the West Coast, you'd want to be running on the West Coast zone because it's closer to you. We only have one, so it's called Nova by default. Time since created tells you how long this VM has been alive. 0 minutes because I just made it. Some of them you'll see, if you leave one up for a while, you might have one that's, several months old, and that's okay. So then you have these actions. There are a bunch of them. The useful ones are the soft reboot, which is basically hitting the reboot button once. The hard reboot, which is like Control-Alt-Delete of death. And then the shut off, which really is like the holding the pillow over the computer. If you feel dirty holding the power button down to shut off your computer, you should feel that dirty if you ever hit this shut off button, because it's basically the same thing. And then the delete instance, if you decide that you want to put your resources to something else, you can simply just delete the instance and your resources will go back into your pool. So right now, the thing we primarily care about is this button that says console. So what this is it's actually a virtual console to our VM. There's a trick to this console, and that is this gray bar. Actually, you have to click. If you don't click this and you click somewhere else, you may not actually get your input. So I clicked on the page here, and it's not letting me do any input now. I'm clicking all over and nothing's happening. So if I click on this gray bar, there's my input. So if your VM is not responding, you think it's down, but your cursor is still blinking, make sure you click on this gray bar. So this is my instance. You can see that this one is nice, and it gave me the username right there and a default password right there. So I'm going to go ahead and see if it works. Bingo! I'm in. So now I can also do this funny thing where I do an ifconfig, and look at that. The same address that I expected got put into it. So now I should be able to do things like nslookup google.com, and it's going to tell me where google.com is. How about that? So if I ping google.com, I get a response. How about that? It's about a whirlwind tour of starting up a VM. Just to finish it off, I'm going to go back to my instances, and I am going to delete it. So when you delete it, it asks you, are you sure? It's kind of like, are you sure? Because once you delete it, you can't really get it back. So be sure when you delete an instance that you're deleting the right one, because we can't help you if you accidentally blow up a VM that had your homework on it. But the moral of that story is, don't do your homework on our servers, because we don't offer that kind of protection. That's what the engineering department is for. Do your homework on their servers. Make it their problem. So I think that's where I'm going to leave this one for today. About 14 minutes, not too long, kind of short and sweet, I hope. I will follow this one up with some more advanced topics on doing some fun networking and stuff. So thanks for watching, and I hope to catch you next time.